Gurmy's Coastal Yard here, and in today's episode of Germanator Studios, we are continuing work on our GCI wooden roller coaster. And in today's episode, we do quite a bit of theming on the ride. At least that's primarily what we do. Anyhow, but to start work, we are working on our train, just doing a little bit of touch-up work on it. And here we are making the bridge that goes across. And I found a useful technique for making sort of a ramp out of terrains. As you can see, getting a square the same size as the ramp. And it happened to be that the ramp was 5 units tall. So it sort of worked out that the square was enough. You can see where I brought the entire square of terrain up to the right height, and then one at a time I dropped each sort of level down to the right height. And there you can see me doing it again just to line it up better with the tunnel. And now I'm going along with our, I don't know what the tool is called, but the tool that lets you just edit one square at a time, and I'm editing one square at a time. So just making those into a ramp instead of a staircase, because the last time I checked, cars and vehicles don't navigate stairs super well. I think some do, but most cars do not. So we're going to make it a ramp and make it a little easier for vehicles to drive on. And next, I wanted some space on either side of the rails for in case an evacuation may need to take place. So I got our terrain blocks, because if you use those under the terrain, they hollow it out, as you can see. And then I started placing tan slate walls on the sides. And I brought those up. Now there are no inclined walls to match the gradient of the ramp there. So I brought them up as high as I could. And then you'll see in a moment what we do to cover up the rest of the ramp. But in the meantime, we are just repeating those walls on the other side. So you may recall from our episode with our aerodynamics roller coaster that when we created the catwalks, we used the sort of slope of the terrain to angle fences. And you can see here I'm using fences to create sort of a better looking, or a more a border that doesn't look like the terrain, basically, if that makes sense. So creating a more industrial, I guess, looking border, you could say. Anyhow, we are using that same technique. And then under the ground, just to have something that looks a little more manufactured, maybe that's the right word I was looking for earlier. Where we hollowed it out, we just put some walls in and some office roof pieces just to add a sort of catwalk. And you can also see where on the edges of that, I also included doors. I may remove those later. I just sort of put them to make sure that stayed a restricted area. Now we do have a sidewalk on either side of our road. Not that it would be used regularly, but it is there. So I put in barrier pieces to keep people from falling off, and we used the nice, I can't read that, I can't remember what fence that is, but we used a fence piece on the other side, a nicer looking fence, just to block them off from the road and make sure cars can't accidentally run into people on the sidewalk. And doing that on both sides, of course. And then along the middle, we used a similar technique to making parking spaces, but we used the scaffolding fence because it will slope with the terrain. So I used that on either edge to create a white border, which I realize now, no, it should be white. I forgot for a second what color the road lines are supposed to be, but that is correct. And then using yellow lines down the middle. And like I said, same technique as how we made our parking spaces. So pretty straightforward and pretty effective as well. And then finally, I just put a little tunnel entrance piece right there where the train enters, so people who are walking can't throw stuff down on the tracks as easily, or just to protect from any falling debris or what have you. Anyhow, moving on, we are now working on a roller coaster. Right now, we are putting I guess, girders, you could say, slash roofs, whatever you want to call it, covers, where the roller coaster goes over top of our service road. And that is, of course, so vehicles can access the or they can drive down the road. Realistically, I think it might make more sense down the line to make the road move around the roller coaster. But for right now, this is what I chose to do. Just keep it going in a straight line through the coaster. Anyhow, of course, and right along here, um, I decided, just because this is limited clearance, I would put a little hanging sort of flag, I guess. I don't know what you want to call those. Just a yellow yellow 1/3 height wall, um, to sort of mark the maximum clearance before a truck drives through and risks damaging the roller coaster's structure. And of course, I went through and made sure the clearance height was the same as um, the one from many episodes back for the entrance to the park from the very front. You probably remember the one I'm talking about if you've watched this far into the series. Anyhow, now we are working on the station. And I started with the roof because I knew how much taller I wanted the roof to be from the track, and I wanted it to be tall enough. Well, I'll explain in a moment when I start building the structure, actually. Um, but I was messing with the roof, and I wanted to have it sort of go out as you see there. But the roof pieces didn't line up on the ends where the track enters and exits, so I decided against that. And now what I was going to say earlier is I wanted to make sure there was room enough for the 1/3 height wall in between the roof and the track. However, when I build, I don't build the roofs or the entrances to the to the minimum threshold, because that's a little lower of a threshold than I like. So I find the lowest I can place a piece and go 1/3 height above it when placing scenery pieces above a track, and that worked out just fine here. So I did the roofs 2/3 height above it, and then had room for that 1/3 sliver just to add more space between the bottom edge of the roof and the wall or the track. And then along here, similar to Wodan Timber Coaster at Europa Park, which, as I've mentioned, is what this is inspired by, I just sort of have a netting between the station flyby and the station track itself, just because it is so low to the ground. And the station does exit on the same side it enters on. I think at Wodan, I know for a fact on Wodan you exit at opposite sides, but I can't remember if you walk underneath the flyby track, or I'm pretty sure what happens is you exit at like one end or the other of the station, but I don't remember because it's been what, 5 years now since I wrote it, going on 5 years. So not that it matters. And now, because I started on top with the roof, and since I'm using full height wall pieces, instead of guessing and building up from the bottom, I decided to build down from the top, and I was left with a 2/3 height gap between the top and bottom, so I decided to fill that in with the castle wall pieces from the adventure scenery. And I just used the 2/3 wall with base, and that created a nice bottom edge for our build. And then going across there with the office roof pieces to make sure we have a solid floor across the rest of the structure. Now I may change that to be the wooden porch pieces just to fit in with the build a little better, but I'm not sure yet. There are some liberties you can take when you do things like that, because Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 stations are not like realistic stations. There are no air gates or anything like that. You simply walk through the little ticket booth and then get right on the coaster. So there are some liberties you can take as to how you want to approach that. Do you want to approach it to look good for the game, or do you want to approach it to look more realistic? And right there I went the realistic route with sort of a gray concrete-esque flooring. But moving on from that, we are starting with our transfer track for the storage area, and I started to use my normal technique of finding the little office roof pieces that have that structure on them. And for steel coasters, it works great, and even for most wooden coasters, um, there's no reason you can't use this method. But as you'll see in a little bit, I just didn't like the way it sort of clipped through the walls, and just the way it lined up with things I didn't quite like. So you'll see here in a moment, we start deleting those pieces. And yeah, we're starting that now. And I ended up going with a little bit more custom of a transfer track and just something that I felt would work a little bit better and be a little more realistic to a GCI coaster. So we went with something that doesn't really have like the catwalk space underneath the transfer track, um, and something a little more simple. And I think this works a lot better for the structure in the long run, and it just looks a lot better in the end, as I'm sure you will see. And of course, I'll have more commentary on that in a little bit. But in the meantime, I'm just adding a railing along here to keep people who may be on that transfer platform, just to keep them safe, because I believe we do put a little flooring underneath there in a moment. Of course, using the office roof pieces. And where else? What else are we doing? Oh, yes, building up an edge. So this is not really an enclosed building, it's an open building. So I used the porch pillar pieces on top, and I had to stack them too high, sorry, to make sure there was enough room between the track and the roof so people don't smack their hands. And then here I'm realizing that I built it one tile too long, so I'm just deleting everything on that tile and I'm moving the structure back by a tile. And yeah, and then putting a little doorway there just to block off that little behind the scenes area where I will eventually put a staircase up to the ride, as well as yeah. And then sorry, I was trying to remember if I did custom supports in there or not, but I ended up finding a wall that was keeping the supports from going all the way down and deleting it. So we have supports there, and eventually, I think soon, but we'll find out, we'll have that little staircase in there. And then there I just deleted the roof so that way I could have better access for placing these sort of girder pieces. So I wanted to have a little more structure to the roof since it's so tall and so open and visible from the ride. So just something to make it look a little more plausible. And now on the back side of that, we are building out our storage area. And for this, as always, I am using a new roller coaster with station pieces, and that way, should I choose to take a train off the ride, I can put one on there, I can add one on, and just to have the continuity of the 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 park preserved, I guess, if that makes sense. But I've talked plenty about that before, so I don't really need to repeat myself very much. Anyhow, um, here I'm just building up the walls, but they were slightly too short, so I go back and place a 1/3 height wall all along the top before finishing it off with a roof. And as you will see with the roofs, I believe so. Okay, I did my too high or my too wide roof there, and I went to use the flatter porch roof, but I noticed that the overhang got into the area where the track and the train are, and it would be too close for riders. It would be at risk of injury. So I went with the flat roof instead, and just put a little border on that, and put some windows in there for to have some natural light for maintenance workers, and just to look good because that is completely exposed to anybody in the park. And finally, we're just putting in the stairs and the little doorway, trying to find if there's a better spot for the doorway, but I ended up settling for the one that was there, although I may go back and adjust that later to make that design a little more optimal with the stairs and the doorway, because I see some ways that it could be improved. Anyhow, moving on from that, um, just as a small detail, I'm putting in the bamboo support pieces, whatever you want to call them, underneath the ride there, um, just where there are no natural supports in that little tunnel area. And getting started with a queue, which will change quite a bit through the course of this episode. And right here, I am putting in a staircase, and eventually you'll see there are no ramps up to the ride area. And my reason for this, and I realized I forgot to build it in this episode, but I decided to go with an elevator next to the exit ramp, and we will build that in the next episode, hopefully if I remember. Eventually that will get built though. So you can see I had one flat piece going out from the exit ramp, and then started the stairs. That's what I settled on. And then along here you can see me sort of picking a path for our queue line, and I extend it a few blocks past the exit ramp here, with the intention of eventually building a photo booth in that little green area. But you will see by the end of this episode how we end up doing the photo booth and readjusting the queue line. So in the meantime, what am I doing? Ah, yes, putting in some porch roofs here, and you can see I wanted to have the porch roof all along there, and eventually have a porch roof along the back little straightaway. But unfortunately, this meant I had to change the queue line, because I couldn't put that staircase right out of the queue line anymore. It got in the way of the porch roof, and we were able to readjust it just fine, and finish off this little enclosed portion of the queue. And most of the queue will be covered in the end, and I was glad I was able to figure out a nice way to do that. Right along here, you can see me trying to find a way to put some supports in place for our next set of porch roofs. And I ended up on the outside edge placing some porch pillars, and then on the back edge, I just placed solid walls, and I think that works fine in the end. And eventually, I believe I do shorten this when I change how I want our photo booth to be. Yep, you can see right there I changed it. And eventually you'll see where I decide, yes, so here's where I'm building our photo booth, right at the end of this pathway, and I readjusted the exit ramp a little bit so it comes out right next to the entrance, and I built up the photo booth similar to how I've done other photo booths and gift shops, using that same technique of placing the walls on the outside edge around where we're going to have the stalls, and then building up a structure around and behind it. And in a few moments, you'll see where I place the things, the custom stalls in there. But in the meantime, we're doing a final readjustment of our queue, just to work better with that back edge of the building. So that way there's no intersections, and that way it's a little more difficult for guests to try and climb on that roof, where before it was very possible. And what I've learned in working in this theme park industry is that if guests can do something, they will. Not to say every guest will climb on that roof, but someone will do it eventually, and so it's better to plan for it in the beginning. Likewise, we're putting a little fence on the top of that edge, partly for decor, just to add a nice sort of ornament on top of the edge of that wall where the exit ramp is, but also to keep people from trying to climb on that roof. And finally, we're going through and placing some scenery around the ride. I was rather conservative with the scenery in that area because I did more in the queue because guests spend more time looking at it. On the ride, I did go through in a few spots where the scenery, where I thought scenery could work with like the windmill and stuff, but mostly on the ride, um, we were pretty sparing with it. Although, as you will see eventually, I do have something I think is fun that we do create in a little bit, but I won't spoil that just yet. Anyhow, moving along with the scenery, I decided where we have our little path flyby, with the final turnaround. I wanted something kind of cool for the guests and something that would look cool for the people on the ride as well. But mainly it's more for the theme as the guests see it. And that is putting that little wooden sort of tunnel entrance on there, with the little gold mine placard, and creating a little micro tunnel, I guess, if you could call it that. And while I was constructing that, I had the idea to use another one towards the beginning of the ride, and this is that little thing I was telling you about. So I thought, well, what if we did some sort of indoor pre-lift section? Something that was kind of unique, something that would keep us from having to mask the behind-the-scenes areas in a unaesthetically pleasing way. So I created an indoor structure, and I started with the walls because I didn't know exactly how I was going to make it work in such a confined space, and building right up against turns on these roller coasters can be kind of tricky. So luckily I was able to make it work. Granted, it's not exactly in a, you'll see, like we had to do those zigzags basically. There was no really great or conventional way to get it done. But given that it's a behind the scenes thing, I'm not very concerned about that at all. And of course, right in there where we have the little bunny hill, we just had to make the roof a little bit taller. And for the most part, in the end, I think this worked really well. And in a moment, I think in a few minutes, or maybe right here, we'll see. We extend this, yeah, all the way to the base of the lift hill. And it starts with the little gold mine entrance and ends with a little cave entrance. Um, just a subtle detail, but something I thought was cool, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And you'll see what it looks like too at the end of the video in the POV. But don't skip ahead because there's more to be seen and more of the process to explain. So, of course, I'm going through and painting a concrete base because structures have to have some sort of foundation most of the time, certainly in the theme park. And just adding my own set of custom supports along the bottom, just using the 1/3 height slate walls as girders essentially in that building. Um, Retrospectively, I think, and even in the little tunnel we have underneath the station, I don't know why I didn't think to do this, but what I should have done and what I would normally think to do is use the scaffolding wall pieces from the um, from the colored wall set, the same ones that we used for the lift hill and the brake runs and stuff on our aerodynamics coaster. I think those work a little bit better for custom wood structures. Those are what I use when I design RMC iBox coasters in here. Granted, there's no iBox track, but that's besides the point. Those are what I use. Um, so, moving on, we're just putting in the roofs on here using my standard office roof piece, whatever strategy. One thing you'll notice though that's different is that everything here is black. And because this is such a short building and I don't think it will be visible from anywhere in the park, granted I will check that later, but because it's not visible, I decided not to use a go away green color and on the roof, just use a dark color so that way it blends in better with the building itself. And from the interior, it masks itself. So for what it's worth, I thought it was fine. And you also, like on small buildings like that, you may see a darker colored roof and not a gray colored roof. Really where it's just a pitch roof and not, you don't have like gravel on top of the roof, which some roofs do have gravel. Um, Granted, I also don't know what the purpose of that is or what difference it makes. I'm guessing it has to do with heating and cooling, but nevertheless, we're not that specific in this park. Uh, that's not my expertise, so I'm not going to dwell on it. Anyhow, where our ride exits the tunnel under the station, I decided to extend the tunnel a little bit with another scenery piece. Um, this started because I wanted to create additional supports for the coaster um, for the station flyby, and um, I started sort of doing a custom support structure, and then this sort of developed organically around it, and I think it turned out really nicely. It looks good from the front. On the ride itself, it feels nice and it feels natural, and from the back side too, as I'm sure you can see it, I think it turned out really nicely. So along here, just placing some more walls. I realize now that I didn't use my 2/3 height wall along the base. I'm not that concerned about it since it isn't really visible from the front. I guess it is visible from the back if you're on the ride, but nevertheless, I wasn't too concerned about it. I think everything looks pretty good how it is, um, and yeah, I'm willing to sacrifice that little bit of seamlessness, I guess, if you want to call it that, for the sake of where it counts. It's not really visible. Anyway, finally, I'm just doing some adjustments on our pre-lift here, and I swapped this out because I didn't want the piece to be banked towards the queue line, because then I thought, well, the rider's reach and just the track, it's a little too close to that for comfort. Um, And granted, I may put a little more structure between the line and the ride so guests couldn't jump on or off. But likewise, everything I guess the envelope, if you want to call it, the clearance envelope was probably a little too tight for comfort for my taste. So I decided to make that adjustment. And then along here, just now I think we're in the stage of just doing random things all around the place. So along the railroad tracks, I decided to paint a stone pathway. I did this along the sort of mountain railroad thing we had in our medieval section, and just because railroad tracks have gravel underneath them, so I wanted to include that detail. And then just painting dirt in a similar manner underneath the track of our ride, where it would be harder for grass to grow because there's limited sunlight. And yeah, and now we're placing the path along this little part of the ride. But while I was doing that, I noticed I thought I wanted to adjust the ride and adjust the profile of the track a little bit because it sort of has an upward helix, but I wanted it to stay lower for longer so guests could get a better view. So I started trying with a downward helix, but I didn't like where it cut out the supports, so I just had a flat level turn and did the same turn upward, but it doesn't go back down. It's not really a hump into the station. It just levels out right away, and I think it turned out just fine how it ended up. It's kind of a similar profile to the ending of Mystic Timbers, where it has that up and to the left curve into the state or into the final brake run, and yeah, just putting more dirt along the paths, underneath the paths, I should say. And because they're dirt paths, yeah, I wanted to have dirt under them. Finally, anyway, here are some montage pictures of our attraction, and coming up is the POV. So I will let you guys enjoy that in peace, and I will see you in the next episode. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and goodbye.